Throughout his work, David Garland contends that by the end of the 20th century, capital punishment was abolished by all of the developed nations of the West, with the United States as being the sole exception. According to Garland, modern Western history has been shaped by liberalization, civilization, and humanization, which has by and large been initiated by cultural elites. Even though the U.S. is the only industrialized modern nation to practice the death penalty, he contends that more than 100 countries still retain capital punishment, at least in some form. In nations such as China, Iran, Singapore, Sudan, and Saudi Arabia, the death penalty is often painful and applied in a public manner. This, in many respects, helps the institution retain its power as a penal and political instrument. Nevertheless, beginning in the middle of the 19th century, there was a tendency throughout the world to make executions less public and more private. Garland examines three eras of capital punishment in the West since the Middle Ages. He refers to the first era as the early modern mode. This period took place between 14 to 1700. During this time, the state began to emerge, and as a result, the death penalty during this era became more public, more ceremonial, as well as more violent. And the new states throughout the world sought to strike fear in the hearts of enemies, namely political offenders. And abolitionist rulers during the early modern era utilized the death penalty as a tool to make the state appear powerful. In reality, the state was politically weak, and it often lacked a well-developed police force or prison system. And so during this time period, the method of execution also reflected the condemned person's rank, status, and offense. For example, in early France, Garland talks about decapitation, especially with a sword, was considered to be a noble form of execution. On the other hand, hangings were usually reserved for common criminals, while drawing and quartering was reserved for traitors or political offenders. Throughout much of this era, there were commonly understood symbols and execution rituals. Executions during this time were advertised through broadsheets. Also, it was not uncommon for a condemned person to be given an opportunity to make a final speech. Also, it was believed that the condemned person would ultimately be judged by God. There was a battle for the state of the soul, and people traveled from miles around to watch this drama unfold. Interestingly, during this period, there was no deep controversy which surrounded the state's right to kill lawbreakers. In the early modern era, executions were highly integrated into the fabric of society. By the early 19th century, the death penalty was restricted throughout Western nations. However, some nations, such as England, would not begin making significant reforms until the 1830s. Still, even though certain regions within the United States refrained from using the death penalty during the early 19th century, America was at the forefront of using prisons rather than capital punishment. In fact, during this time, Alex de Tocqueville, who was a prominent French political thinker, visited the United States and wrote that he was quite impressed that Americans had expunged capital punishment. Of course, there was still a variation from colony to colony, and some colonies did still practice this, even though it wasn't very much. In Pennsylvania, for example, William Penn limited the application of the death penalty only to premeditated murder. This was in 1682 and was very progressive thinking for the time. So it is fair to say that during this era, America administered much more humane punishments than England, which still had the bloody code around this time. Garland, of course, refers to England's Bloody Code earlier and in some depth in the book. Throughout the world, as alternative punishments such as transportation and imprisonment became viable options, there was much less of a need for the death penalty during this era, which Garland refers to as the modern era. And by the 1890s, Western nations also began to establish probation, reformatory prisons, parole, and indeterminate sentencing. As nations became more secure, executions were, by and large, no longer viewed as a method to demonstrate state authority. Also during this time, executions became much less public. They often took place inside the prison rather than in the public square. Also, only a small number of offenses were punishable by death in the vast majority of Western nations during the modern era. And every person who was executed was punished in the same uniform fashion. Executions during this era lost much of their religious character. The process was also redesigned to be efficient and humane. Over time, executions experienced what Garland refers to as delocalization. And this term refers to the fact that executions in most countries occurred under the supervision of national rather than local authorities. Delocalization helped to reduce disparities between regions in any given nation. Garland contends that the late modern era began in the 1960s, and all across the West, nations were concerned with social welfare and human rights. And during the 1960s, America, France, and Britain reportedly saw a significant decline in their annual execution rate. And one by one, Western nations began to abolish the death penalty. It was abolished in Britain in 1965, in Spain in 1975, and in France in 1981. By all accounts, it seemed as though the United States would join other Western nations. As we know from the book, in 1972, the court abolished capital punishment as it was practiced. However, only 4 short years later, the death penalty would be reinstated in America. Incidentally, it was reinstated again by the U.S. Supreme Court. And interestingly, I think Garland insinuates that this may have been due to the fact that the court's composition was altered by President Nixon's appointees to the court. And we know, of course, that Nixon was a staunch social conservative. By the 1980s, the United States was left as the only retentionist nation in the West. Today, in the United States, only 35 states and the federal government and the military, for that matter, have the death penalty. And the majority of states in the U.S. that have the death penalty do not use it. Moreover, the court has narrowed the situations where an individual can be sentenced to death. For example, minors, the mentally retarded, and child rapists who do not kill their victims can no longer be put to death in the U.S. Interestingly, delocalization also occurred in American states. However, Garland contends that this was only partially done. For example, even today in capital cases, the prosecution and sentencing decision remain under local control in the U.S. Key decisions, in other words, are made by county-level decision makers. Interestingly, the death penalty in America is highly contested, and there are transnational pressures for abolition that have been exerted by organizations throughout the world on the U.S., and many advocates for capital punishment argue that it should be retained since the practice is supported by a majority of the people and therefore must reflect democratic principles. Garland contends that in some respects America may have the death penalty due to the fact that the Founding Fathers created a small national government with limited capacities to a large group of states and local authorities. And the separation of powers, as well as the Bill of Rights, is a further check on the federal government. And it is true that the national government of the U.S. Shares more power with states than most other economically advanced countries. And this has given rise to an emergence of powerful local decision makers who are able to make important decisions in regard to whether or not an individual is charged with a capital crime. And this is an aspect of the type of localism which is a key aspect of American society. And because of localism, which is persistent in the U.S., there is substantial variation from state to state and even from county to county as to whether or not or how often local prosecutors seek the death penalty as a viable punishment option. Also in the United States, this problem is compounded by the fact that policymakers are often political appointees whose tenure may stretch no further than the next election. In most other Western nations, policymakers enjoyed somewhat tenured positions, or at least a considerably higher degree of job security. Given the vulnerability of American policymakers, it is no wonder that they strive to get the public what it wants, even if it may not always know what it needs. And if this means passing draconian criminal justice policies, which has led to the mass imprisonment of 2.3 million Americans, which, by the way, is often comprised of young minority males, this is problematic to many scholars, and it is alarming that in most death penalty states within the U.S., the district attorney, state judge, county sheriff, and maybe even the police chief are often elected individuals who run for office. And as a result, these actors tend to align themselves with get tough law and law and order campaigns. And this could include harsh sentencing and, of course, capital punishment. And compared with most European nations, the fate of an individual offender depends more on local community dynamics and less on an apolitical rule of law. And Garland seems leery of the fact that criminal justice policymaking in the U.S. is much more populist and expressive of community sentiment than virtually all other Western nations. And there's quite a bit to absorb in this section of the book. As you're reading through the chapters, think about what Garland has to say about the South's legacy of slavery and whether or not this has affected the development of local government in the South. There are many, many points to consider, which I have not covered here, that are worthy of our consideration if we are to truly understand America's peculiar institution of capital punishment in an age of abolition.